Dr. Guelzo, I wanted to start where oftentimes some of these conversations about Abraham Lincoln build up to. That is some of the criticisms of President Lincoln, and in particular his views on race. And we can cherry pick, I guess, in a sense, lots of historical examples from the direct allegation that the only reason he is the great emancipator had nothing to do with his desire to free the slaves, but had far more to do with his desire to maintain the Union, to win the war. And uh, curious views about mass deportation of Black Americans to even far-flung places of the world like Liberia. And I wanted to briefly read from you from Harry Joffe's book Crisis of the House Divided, a quote I had found of Lincoln that is just very shocking, I think, for those of us who think of Lincoln as the great emancipator, where Lincoln, and this is his word, saying, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor of intermarry with white people. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And as much as any other man am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." So I just want to ask the question directly. Was Abraham Lincoln a racist?
Does a racist put weapons into the hands of black men, clothe them in the uniform of the United States, and send them out to kill genuine white supremacists in gray uniforms? Is that what you expect from a racist? Is a racist someone who, in the last speech that he gives in his life, talks about the importance of extending the vote to the newly freed slaves and extending public education to them, to their offspring? A comment which draws from a member of the crowd the promise, I know what that means, I'm going to put him through. That comment, of course, came from John Wilkes Booth, and we know what happened as a result of that. Is that what you would call the mark, if we're speaking of Lincoln, of a racist? When Frederick Douglass goes for the first time to meet Lincoln in 1863, Douglass, who has been frankly critical of Lincoln on many points up to that moment, he goes to meet Lincoln and says afterwards, "I was treated by him as one gentleman would treat another. I tell you, I felt big there." Is that the mark of a racist? So I put this question by way of response, and it suggests that there is more to this question than simply that one quote from the fourth of the Lincoln Douglas debates at Charleston, Illinois, in 1858. Yes, there is a good deal more to it because human beings being what they are and history being what it is, it's almost always more complicated than it seems just by cherry picking one quote here or one incident there. I mean, in a sense, I could be accused of being cherry picking incidents on the other side of things. I hope I'm not, but I am suggesting hold on before we jump into the pool with that conclusion. I'd ask you to consider very carefully the way Lincoln talks in that opening of the Charleston debate from 1858. Notice how he qualifies what he's saying when he talks about equality. No, I don't believe in the social and political equality of black and white. He will go on then to add what I do believe in is the natural equality of black and white, the kind of natural equality that you find captured in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, the proposition that Lincoln says at Gettysburg we are dedicated to. And then I ask you to pay attention to the illustration he gives of that. He goes on to say that in the right of the black man to eat the bread which he has earned by the sweat of his brow, he is my equal, Judge Douglas's equal, and the equal of every living man. So he is drawing a distinction here that we don't often draw today between natural rights and social and political rights. Natural rights are things which are hardwired into every human being. We're born with them. They are self-evident. They are inalienable, according to Jefferson. Social and political rights are variable. Social and political rights vary with a particular political organization, a particular political time. There was a time, for instance, when we didn't extend some social and political rights to women. We do now. Social and political rights change. They change over time. They change from place to place. They change, in some cases, because the atmosphere of the politics changes. We haven't, in fact, changed some things which are examples of inequality. We do not let 10-year-olds drive 2-ton trucks. So are we committing a social and political inequality? Yes. We would immediately respond, yes, well, that's common sense. You don't let 10-year-olds drive 2-ton trucks. Well, common sense in one era might not be the common sense of another. I have a grandson who is very skilled at driving a little electric go-kart around the family farm. So there, things like that, they change over time. They shift over time. That's social and political rights. But natural rights don't. And in terms of natural rights, those are always constant, and those speak of equality. And one person who recognized what Lincoln was implying by this was Stephen A. Douglas.
Mm-hmm.
Because Douglas latches onto that and says, well, if you listen to what Lincoln has to say about natural equality of natural rights, then what's waiting around the corner is social and political equality. So if you want social and political equality, the very things that Lincoln is telling you he doesn't believe in, if you want those things, vote for Lincoln, because once you've conceded natural equality, then that's going to come very shortly thereafter. And for once in his life, Stephen A. Douglas was right. Because this is, in fact, what you see developing in Lincoln, and especially in Lincoln's presidency. Now, I know that people will argue, well, yes, but he was only saying that because he was a politician. Of course he was saying that because he was a politician. He is a politician. Politicians say things like that. Would I have preferred that he had come out straightforwardly and declared, as Frederick Douglass wished he had, in talking about a real, a genuine, a fully realized equality? Sure, but I'm not a politician. And I'm 150 years later. In Lincoln's time, what can he say? What can he persuade people of? He is, after all, running for office. Is that a concession that is damaging? Yes, but most politicians make damaging concessions. So let's give him one check mark on the negative side of the ledger. But let's also notice how many other check marks he piles up on the other side of the ledger. And let us not be ready to cast the first stone if we ourselves are not without sin, politically speaking.
I appreciate the nuance of your answer because, as I mentioned in the green room, where I'm hoping to drive our conversation is around the central topic of prudence, and Lincoln perhaps is an example of that. And so I wanted to start off with the darker side, if you will, because is in an age in which there is such a seeming demand for a absolutist pursuit of pure principle. I think there is no room sometimes for prudence, for the acknowledgement that sometimes things cannot be pursued in an absolute fashion. And you had written that the prime American example of prudence in political life was Abraham Lincoln. So I'm wondering, maybe we can do some level setting first. Could you define for us, when you say prudence, what do you mean? What does the word prudence mean in a political sense?
The word prudence has a long history. It goes back, of course, to the Greeks. They used the term phronesis, and what it means is practical wisdom. In other words, not only being right, but knowing how to implement the rightness, knowing how to persuade people of what is right, knowing how to bring people along in such a way that the idea which is right does not suffer because people were clumsy and broken in the way that they implement it. And prudence talks about the importance of both ends and means. We hear all around us voices of uncompromising principle. Well, Lincoln heard them too. There were the abolitionists of his day, someone like William Lloyd Garrison, who eschewed all political approaches to the question of the abolition of slavery, and who insisted that, in fact, it would be better to secede from the Union and leave the Union a slavery entity in order to remain pure. Well, if we had done that, if we had listened to William Lloyd Garrison, then perhaps we would have had, let us say, the New England states decide that they were going to quit the Union as what Garrison called, when he talked about the Constitution, a compact with hell, a league with death. All right. And he, of course, is famous for the provocative gesture of actually burning a copy of the Constitution at one of the summer meetings of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Massachusetts. If we had heeded Garrison's plea with us to live completely pure and principled lives, then what would have happened would have been that the rest of the country would have been turned over to the slavery ideologues. We would have divided the American Republic and rendered it weak and nugatory in terms of its influence in world history thereafter. If we had listened to Garrison, who would have been around to confront the universal midnight of Nazism? Who would have been around to have confronted the Soviet Union? Who would have been around to do the kinds of things that we have been able to do that have really proved to be the saving of ideas of liberty and freedom and democracy? We wouldn't have been around at all. Oh, there would have been a little pure rump, but it would have been as irrelevant to world affairs as, well, let us say, Scandinavia. Is that what we wanted to have happen? Would that have been a desirable outcome? It might have pleased the most uncompromising of the abolitionists. But in real practical terms, would that have been wisdom? It might have been principle, but it would not have been wisdom. Now we're starting to see a dramatic illustration of what prudence talks to us about. You have to be concerned not only with ends, you have to be concerned with means. You cannot be devoted entirely to that ancient principle that says, do justice though the heavens fall. That sounds consistent and it makes you feel very good and quite virtuous. The danger is it also means that virtue can sometimes masquerade over self-righteousness. Rather, prudence talks about being guided by the Hippocratic oath, primum non nocere. Above all things, do no harm. Lincoln is a man who's guided by prudence. He's guided by a sense of what is possible, how things can be negotiated, how you can get from point A to point Z without losing your soul, much less your mind. And in that respect, it's easy to dismiss him as a mere politician, a man with no guiding principle. This isn't true. He has very clear guiding principles. He insisted. He said, I've always been opposed to slavery. I can't remember a time when I wasn't opposed to slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. But he also understood that if he was going, in fact, to really put a stake through the heart of slavery, he was going to have to do it by certain means. And merely throwing open a window from his White House office and shouting something down Pennsylvania Avenue, that wouldn't have accomplished anything. How were you going to get people there? So he is an example of prudence because he understands that you cannot talk simply about ends without means. By the same token, you simply can't talk about means, about raw politics, mere politics, without being guided by certain ends, by certain principles. It's the holding of both of those in tandem and moving ahead with them that I think sets Lincoln off from so many of his generation, perhaps makes him so remarkable in American history.
So you say makes him so remarkable, but I'm trying to reflect on, this notion that prudence in politics has a long pedigree, right? We see it in Aristotle, we see it in Burke, Thomas Aquinas. There are so many that say this is I think Burke calls it the god of this lower world, the chief among virtues. It's what the ideal statesman possesses. And I could be wrong here, but I would presume even in Lincoln's day, there was a sense in which you could at least use the vernacular that prudence was something uh, of a higher virtue than maybe in our current day, in our current speak. And I ask this, it's because, yes, I readily accept that in Lincoln's day, there were plenty of imprudent absolutists, just as there are today. But is there something about the moment we live in that is there something about the moment we live in that is almost demanding an imprudent approach? Because it seems like at the periphery you can explain what you just did, and I would suspect the average reasonable person would say, well, absolutely, we want our leaders to be prudent. But then when you go down to the individual issues, they would almost immediately disavow that. So, like, what, if you agree with this idea, what is pulling us in such an imprudent direction? What causes us to almost to graph at what you had just laid out as an ideal?
One reason is because absolute goals in politics can always be reduced to a soundbite. They're easy to grasp, they're easy to listen to, they're easy to rally around. As soon as you begin talking about prudence, then you require long explanations. Look how long it took me to explain it. And after a while, people get bored. They get bored very easily. They wander away. Absolutes are exciting. Absolutes say, draw that line in the sand and be prepared to die for it. Well, yes, that's what got us the Alamo, and the Alamo really didn't accomplish terribly much, but it makes for a very satisfying image in our minds.
We all remember the Alamo.
Exactly. There's Travis drawing that line in the sand. And the metaphor itself lasted longer than Travis did. And when you examine the history of the Texas Revolution in 1835 and 1836, you don't really see that the Alamo contributed very much to the ultimate outcome. But nevertheless, the image is so clear, it's so dramatic, it captures the imagination. Prudence, prudence does not have a whole lot of acolytes because it's patient. It's always balancing things. It's always asking the question. It's involved in self doubt. Self doubt in the sense of maybe I don't have all the answers. Maybe I need to find out something more. Maybe I need to admit I might have been wrong. That kind of self doubt, that kind of humility, that doesn't come nearly so easily as the confidence of absolutes. But is that more typical of our time? I don't know. I think that is for one thing, in the most general sense, I think that's a human plague.
Mm.
But I think it's also been true through American history. There have been terrible moments of conflict, more than we often like to admit. We look back on these terrible moments of conflict and we don't experience them as terrible moments because we're reading about them in the sedate atmosphere of a library. In 1824 or 1828, in 1848, in 1860, and so on like that. Oh no, no. There things seem to be a good deal more vivid. And in those moments when the vivid contrasts are being drawn, those quick absolute sound bites seem to be the only satisfying, or at least emotionally satisfying, solution. Lincoln was suspicious of emotionally satisfying solutions. He spoke of himself in terms of being guided by reason, all conquering reason, as he put it in one speech. Even at the end of his first inaugural, he pleads with the Southern states. Passion has helped us in the past, he had said, but we must not be guided by passion now. What must we be guided by? We must be guided by memory. We must be guided by the memory of battlefields and hearthstones. We must be guided by the memory of how we have been friends. We must not be enemy. That is a step away from the rule of passion. Lincoln is a man of reason. And as a man of reason, what he's going to direct people to is the slow and patient path of prudence. It is a slow path. It is a patient path. It's not an exciting path. which is why some people don't bother to take the trouble to walk down it. Lincoln did. So at the end of the day, then we ask, who then is more successful? Who then provides us with the best outcome? The Garrisonians? Is that the outcome that we would have been happy with? Or Lincoln? Saving the Union and getting rid of slavery at the same time. Let me add a footnote to that. You raised the question, was Lincoln only interested in saving the Union? Yes, he was interested in saving the Union. But that was because he saw saving the Union and getting rid of slavery as two sides of the same coin.
Hmm.
There would be no point in saving the Union if you were going to do nothing about slavery, because slavery was the thing that had almost destroyed the Union. But at the same time, the kind of campaign he wants to wage against slavery is precisely the thing that is going to save the Union. It's going to save the Union that the founders had in view. It's going to save a Union that will embody government of the people, by the people, for the people, that will not perish from the earth.
This obviously stands in stark contrast to much of the politics of today, and I don't want to just simplify it or boil it down to say presidential administrations, but I'm thinking, as extremely brief footnotes of Barack Obama's executive order with DACA when Congress did not act in the manner he had long hoped that it would, and he essentially went back on his word that look, I'm not a dictator, I can't just by some sort of executive fiat make this possible, and then he does that. Um, at a different context, Donald Trump with wall funding, or Joe Biden with student tuition, right? Debt forgiveness. That these are these things that are of such importance that it makes sense to kind of bend the rules a little bit. This is a far cry from the terrible moment of the Civil War. And I'm wondering, could you walk us through, and maybe I'd even say give the Cliff Notes version to how Lincoln depicts an individual who, in spite of arguably the greatest disaster to ever face our country, still behaved in a prudent manner that respected the boundaries he understood the executive office to have placed upon him.
Well, understand first of all that as highly as I rate Lincoln in the history of American politics, I haven't yet, I think anyway, I haven't yet tagged him as perfect.
Sure.
And I often remind people that Lincoln did not walk on the Potomac. He did not do miracles. So bear that in mind. When we talk about Lincoln as a president, his record is not 100%. There are points which I think he made some serious mistakes. And one department in particular concerns matters of civil liberties in time of war. I am very dubious about the rationale that he offers for the kinds of arrests of certain individuals, like the notorious Clement Vallandigham. Vallandigham, who was an opponent of the Lincoln administration, who spoke frequently and publicly criticizing the Lincoln administration for the way it was conducting this war, for conscription, for other policies. And of course, he gets arrested by military authorities. Lincoln tries to justify that by saying, well, civil liberties are one thing in a time of peace, and the Constitution, yes, must be obeyed, but in time of war, in time of public emergency, well, then there's a different environment. No, Lincoln was wrong, and that was a serious mistake. But it was not as serious as it might have been. He does not establish himself as a dictator. He will, on the one hand, issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, on what authority? On what authority does he issue the Emancipation Proclamation? Well, strictly speaking, he knows that he does not have authority as President of the United States to issue proclamations of that sort. And mind you, this is an era that has not yet invented things called executive orders.
Hmm.
That won't happen until the Grant administration. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation because he doesn't have the authority as president to reach over the legal and constitutional firewall separating national from state jurisdictions. And remember that slavery was the law in the southern states by state enactments, not by federal enactments. Lincoln doesn't have the authority as president to reach over that wall, at least not at that moment in the history of the Constitution. What he does, though, is to invoke an authority bestowed on him in the Constitution as commander-in-chief. And he will insist that he's issuing the Emancipation Proclamation as a wartime measure taken in the exercise of his responsibilities as commander-in-chief to defeat an insurrection. If you want to pull the plug on the Confederate rebellion, the way to do it is to declare their slaves free. That will cripple them. And so his reasoning is, in that respect, constitutional, but he was conscious of the fact he was pushing the envelope, so to speak. He said frequently, I believe that the proclamation is constitutional. I believe it does fall within the orbit of my authority as commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. I can do that. But he also admitted, once the war emergency is over, the courts may think otherwise.
Mm.
And one of the reasons he presses so hard by 1865 for a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery is precisely because he wants that in place before the war ends and before the federal courts might, in fact, overturn emancipation. Now, today we would think, it'd be unthinkable that federal courts would overturn the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, bear in mind that up until October of 1864, in other words, well through the Civil War, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court was still Roger Brooke Taney, the author of the Dred Scott decision.
Mm-hmm.
And it was rumored that Taney had already, in advance, written opinions that if he had had an opportunity made by an appeal to pass some kind of judgment on the proclamation, would have struck it down. If he had done that, that would have set the cause of emancipation back at least another political generation. So Lincoln is painfully conscious of that vulnerability. That's why he wants that constitutional amendment, but it's also why the Emancipation Proclamation has all these conditions and exceptions built into it. He will not, for instance, free the slaves in the border states of Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland. They hadn't joined the Confederacy, but slavery was still legal there. Why doesn't he emancipate the slaves there? The answer is he doesn't have the authority to do it as commander-in-chief. They're not at war with the United States. So he wants a more comprehensive settlement of this, but at the same time, he knows he can't take a step even beyond that. And in September of 1863, when his Treasury Secretary, Salmon Chase, a very uncompromising abolitionist, or at least very sympathetic to them, when Chase exhorts him to expand the scope of the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln writes back to him and says, I can't do that. I don't have the authority to do that. If I did that, he says, would I not be in the boundless field of absolutism? Would I not be giving away the whole cause that we're fighting for, which is the cause of the Constitution? So, yes, he's going to put some dents in this thing called executive action. And sometimes the dents he puts in it, I have to admit, are not good dents. There are other times when he's being, I think, intelligently creative. And the Emancipation Proclamation is an example of that. But even with the proclamation, what is governing him? Governing him is that sense of prudence, of what is possible. He doesn't exceed it. He doesn't step beyond it. He's careful in how he defines it. And he keeps looking for solutions, even for the problems and the questions he hasn't entirely answered. If you want a really good example of a principled movement, which is also a prudent movement in politics, I'm very inclined to point you in the direction of the Emancipation Proclamation.
So the Emancipation Proclamation obviously could not have been Plan A, say for those who are hoping to abolish slavery, right? Let's involve ourselves in a civil war, and then we can kind of come through a back door to get to this. If we step back to prior to the Civil War, what was Lincoln and, say, that nascent Republican Party's, what was their end game? Because I think of it from like the perspective of the founders, even people like Thomas Jefferson that seem to acknowledge, yeah, slavery's a problem, but it'll kind of, these are my words, it'll work itself out eventually, right? We don't have to worry about this. And it was, they didn't have any way of anticipating Eli Whitney and the cotton gin and the boom of cotton in the South and how that would expand slavery for possibly forever. What was the Republican Party's goal, if not a civil war that gets us to this?
Well, there's some question if the Republican Party actually knew what it had as a specific goal, because the Republican Party, just to start with, was a composite. It was a coalition. It was a coalition of old Northern Whigs, like Lincoln, but it also added old Northern anti-slavery Democrats who felt betrayed by their party, but who otherwise had been at war with the Whigs for all of their lives. It included some abolitionists who hoped they could push the Republican coalition further along the road. It included some nativist know-nothings for whom their issue, most important issue, was immigration, but because slavery was a second issue, were willing to throw their lot in with the Republicans. Republicans are a coalition. Sometimes it's hard to say what their aim was. Their aim tended to be multiple, and there is a certain multiple personality disorder in the early Republican Party as people try to sort out exactly what it's supposed to do. But what they all did agree upon was their opposition to the expansion of slavery. And this becomes the bottom line for the Republicans. Do not allow slavery to expand beyond the states where it is currently legal. And what they're doing is they're extending an assumption that really you find the earliest traces of at the Constitutional Convention itself. Because at the Constitutional Convention, when the question about slavery arises, as it was inevitably bound to arise, you have on the one hand voices from delegates in the convention who want to say, we need to make a statement on this subject of slavery because slavery is not compatible with the principles for which we fought the revolution. We need to say something about that. The response, of course, came from Southern delegates and said, if you try to lay a finger on slavery, we're going to walk out of here, and there won't be a United States. So, what is the path? How is that negotiated? It's negotiated by people like Oliver Ellsworth, like Roger Sherman, ultimately by James Madison. And that is to say, look, slavery is a dying institution. We can all see that it's dying. And there's going to come a time very shortly when there aren't going to be any slaves. And the idea that there had ever been slavery in the American Republic, people are going to forget about it. So let's just make no mention whatsoever of slavery in the Constitution. Let's make no mention, as Madison said, that there could be such a thing as property in men. And we will let time simply wash this problem out of our system. And that becomes fundamentally the position of the Constitutional Convention. Well, you're right, Eli Whitney and the Industrial Revolution make that an impossibility. So how do you do this thing of dealing with slavery? In a sense, the Republican argument is an extension of the Constitutional Convention. All right, slavery didn't go away on its own. However, if you limit its growth, slavery depends on growth. Slavery depends on finding new territory to expand into. All right, let's build a Berlin Wall around it. Let's contain slavery in the places where it's right now legal and do not let it expand into the Western territories, which is to say most of what was west of the Mississippi River. And if you do that, then slavery will asphyxiate on its own. It will consume all the air and it'll die out. And what's more, it'll be, as the image was often used, like a scorpion in a bottle, stinging itself to death. All right, if we can prevent that expansion of slavery into the territories, that will bring a peaceful end to slavery. So that's what we need to put in place. And if there was a consensus in Republican minds about how to deal with slavery and bring an end to slavery in America, that was it, and that was Lincoln's position. In his great Peoria speech of October 16th, 1854, he said, if it was all up to me, and I was the only person to make a decision, I would say, Get rid of slavery entirely, free all the slaves. However, then he backs up and says, I know that's not practical. So that's not going to happen. What we can do, though, is that we can prevent slavery from having a future. And the way to prevent it from having a future is to prevent its expansion into the West. Now, that was small consolation to the abolitionists. And it was even smaller consolation to the slaves of the South, because basically
Mm-hmm.
it was saying, you're going to have to sacrifice yourselves to the future. You're going to have to endure slavery, because at some future date, things will eliminate slavery. And that's asking, oh my, what is that asking of people?
Mm-hmm.
But what are the solution? What other solution did Lincoln have in view? The abolitionist solution? Break up the Union? Descend into irrelevance? The solution of purity? On the other hand, you just surrender to the slave owners every time they make a demand for the future? No. Again, Lincoln is looking, what is the middle path forward? The middle path forward is prevent the extension of slavery. And that becomes the original position that he occupies. Even he will articulate that in the first inaugural. It's the South that makes it impossible. It's the South, ironically, which is the mirror image of the abolitionists. If
Mm-hmm.
the abolitionists were totally uncompromising about abolishing slavery, the slave owners were just as maniacal in their determination that it should be slavery, slavery, and nothing but slavery all the time. Between the two maniacal extremes, when you position Lincoln that way and see him in that light, then Lincoln starts to sound a whole lot more reasonable. Not perfect, but reasonable.
So, was there an evolution? Because you mentioned this as Lincoln's original position, and it sounds like to whatever degree there was an agreement within the Republican coalition about we're going to stop the expansion of slavery. If I'm reading Harry Joffe's Crisis of the House Divided correctly, it sounds like Lincoln had this, and I don't hear this talked about very often, this very pessimistic concern that after Dred Scott, it was almost a, pardon me, it was almost a, excuse me, it was almost a game changer. That now we're facing the possibility that not only could slavery expand out into the westward territories, but there could even come a day where slavery is legal in the entire United States.
Exactly. Because the idea that somehow you could restrict slavery to the states where it's legal, that Congress, because Congress is responsible for organizing the territories and getting them ready for admission to the Union as states, it would be conceivable that Congress would take action to forbid slavery coming into those Western territories. But the Dred Scott decision, which is based, ironically, on what amounts to the first invocation of substantive due process in federal jurisprudence, Tawney says, wait a minute, that's a violation of due process. Slaves are the property of slave owners. If slave owners move into the Western territories, you can't prohibit them from bringing their horses and their pigs and whatnot with them. That's their property. And that would be a violation of the Constitution itself. So you'd be depriving them of their property without due process. Well, slaves are property. If you say to slave owners, you can't take your slaves into the territories, it's a violation of substantive due process. And that becomes the basis of Tawney's argument in Dred Scott. But if that is the case, and Dred Scott, the argument for Dred Scott being a free man and having lost the status of slave because he had been taken into a federal territory, if that argument doesn't work to prevent slavery from being expanded into the territories, then what's going to happen when someone files suit on the basis of a violation of due process if they've taken their slaves into a free state? It's still property. And due process is still due process. And in fact, even as Lincoln is highlighting this dilemma, which he does in the Great House Divided speech in 1858, There already was a case, in fact, working its way up through the federal court system, Lemon versus New York, which made exactly that assertion, that on the basis of due process, that even a state, not just a territory, a state could not forbid slavery, could not forbid a slave owner from bringing slaves into that state, because that would be, yet again, a violation of due process. And Lincoln said, if Dred Scott is allowed to rule the legal territory, rule the legal scene, then what we will shortly see is the legalization of slavery, even in the free states. We will become, as he said, all one thing or all the other. We would be either all free or all slave. That is the warning he is giving in the House Divided speech. His insistence is, let's put things back the way they were when we had compromises in place that would have at least protected the Western territories from the introduction of slavery. And that is the plea he's going to make in 1858 when he's running for the Senate against Stephen A. Douglas. And he can make a very effective argument of that because Stephen A. Douglas had actually invented a solution to this problem called popular sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
A solution which, as Lincoln pointed out with devastating accuracy, really didn't work. Didn't work at all. What you needed to do, and the only real alternative was, you were going to have to make it clear that slavery could not be extended into the territories. You could not make an exception for popular sovereignty because that was going to simply give the game away. It was like putting a 10-foot plank as a bridge across a chasm 10 feet wide. It would look good, but you wouldn't dare step on it. That was popular sovereignty for Lincoln. Now, Lincoln keeps insisting, we are opposing the extension of slavery into the territories because we know that will spell the doom of slavery. And the best confirmation of that comes from the slave owners themselves. Because as soon as Lincoln is elected in November of 1860, what do? They immediately start taking steps to secede from the Union.
Mm-hmm.
They knew what was going to happen. They knew the handwriting on the wall. People look at that and say, oh, well, Lincoln is half-hearted. He's only opposed to the extension of slavery in the territories. I'm saying, come on. People in 1860 knew exactly what that meant long-term, and the best evidence of it is the behavior of the Southern slaveholders, because they knew, okay, game over, we need to get out of Dodge. And that is why they attempt to secede from the Union.
I would love to stay on this topic longer, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask another question or two, a little disjointed from this. One about Lincoln's political economy. In your book, you highlight how Lincoln is in a lot of ways in the mold of an Alexander Hamilton Clay, say, dynamic, where, if I had to just distill it down to the big three, pro-tariffs, pro-infrastructure, pro-national banking. I am really curious about this because I don't know how often Lincoln evokes Alexander Hamilton, but I know that he very often talks about Thomas Jefferson as being this great statesman, possibly the greatest. And I can only imagine Jefferson and Hamilton both spinning in their graves with this sort of incongruity. So I'm wondering, can you help unpackage for me, how is Lincoln seemingly both a Hamiltonian and a Jeffersonian?
Well, there are, for Lincoln, two Jeffersons. One Jefferson is the author of the Declaration of Independence, and especially the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And then there's another Jefferson, and that is the agrarian Jefferson, the Jefferson who was hostile to commerce and manufacturing, the Jefferson who was friendly, maybe not more than friendly, but certainly friendly to slavery. There was also the Jefferson who took shameless and immoral advantage of one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. And that is a Jefferson that Lincoln deplores. There was an early opinion piece that Lincoln wrote condemning that Jefferson. And when you look at Lincoln's career in terms of the economic policies he embraces, it could not be further removed from Jefferson. So the Jefferson that he applauds in the letter he writes in 1859 speaking of Jefferson as the author of the axioms of liberty. The Jefferson he's applauding there is the Jefferson of the Declaration. Take one step beyond that Jefferson, and we are in very different territory. Now, by contrast, is he a Hamiltonian? Well, there's no specific citation that I have ever uncovered of Hamilton in Lincoln's writings. Now, I have worked my way through the Federalist Papers, fine-toothed comb in hand. And it does strike me that there are a number of occasions in which things that Hamilton, Madison, and Jay have to say in the Federalist Papers, which have some very clear parallels and very clear resonance in Lincoln's writings and speeches. Does he quote them? No. But then again, remember, he's a political figure, he's a lawyer, he doesn't do footnotes. So I can direct you to some parallels. And I have the suspicion that if he did not read the Federalist Papers outright, then certainly he's reading what others have written in the spirit of the Federalist Papers. And I would say, in the most general sense, if there are two camps in American political thought, the Hamiltonian and the Jeffersonian, he clearly belongs in the Hamiltonian. Now, does that make him a living, breathing disciple on every point of Alexander Hamilton? Well, no, because as I say, I can't point to any particular citations. He is, however, clearly a disciple of Henry Clay. Henry Clay, he said, was his beau ideal of a statesman, and especially for those three major points that you mentioned: protection and protective tariffs for the development of American manufacturing and commerce, infrastructure, government-funded infrastructure. Why? To promote commercial exchange, to bring consumers and markets together. That's what infrastructure is supposed to do. And then a national banking system that, once again, if you have a national banking system, that promotes exchange and commerce. All of those are things that Lincoln advocates. If we want to say that Henry Clay is a member of the Hamiltonian family, then Lincoln, at least by descent, as an admirer of Clay, yes, is of the Hamiltonian family, even if there's not a direct citation.
So leaving aside the national banking aspect of those broad three, if I think of the infrastructure development, if I think of protection of industries through, say, tariffs, is the political economy of Hamilton, Clay, Lincoln, I could understand some today saying we are the direct descendants of that who find themselves in, say, the nationalist populist movements on the right, the pro-workers aspect, the J.D. Vances, if you will, the Josh Hawleys, maybe to an extent. To what degree would that be correct? And if it's not correct, is it a matter of the scale of what, say, Lincoln's political economy was less than, or is it a difference of kind, or how are these things similar or different?
Well, I think there are some significant differences, and the most fundamental difference between Lincoln and the so-called national conservatives is that Lincoln really believes that the United States is founded on an idea. It has been said in some national conservative circles, America is not an idea, America is a nation. Lincoln would have replied, that gets things exactly opposite. No, America is an idea. It is the idea that made the nation. The nation did not make the idea. The idea made the nation. This is what he says at Gettysburg. We are conceived in liberty and dedicated to a proposition that all men are created equal. That's what we come from. And that means, of course, that we can embrace people from all over the world who are enchanted by that same notion of liberty, that same proposition. It's what drew my great-grandfather from Sweden. Did he come to America because he thought it was going to make him into something other than a Swede? No, he's going to remain, biologically at least, he's going to remain a Swede. What he was enchanted by was the idea. He copied out by hand in pencil the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address. That idea animated him, and that made him an American. Even, I suppose, in some respects, before he even arrived. And the same thing is true over and over again. what makes us what we are as Americans? What do we take an oath to defend? Do we take an oath to defend some kind of American nationality, some kind of American race? There isn't any such thing. We take an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I have taken that oath. My father took that oath. My son took that oath. And I take it seriously. We are dedicated to an idea, and an idea has made us what we are. And that is why we can absorb people from all over. And Lincoln himself testifies to this in the speech he gives on July 10th, 1858, at the very beginning of the Lincoln-Douglas campaign. He says, look at where we are today. Fully half of the people of our country have come from someplace else, or they're the offspring of people who have come someplace else. They don't have any living connection to the American Revolution. Great-grandpa or grandpa was not in the snows at Valley Forge with Washington. They were someplace else. And yet, he said, when they look into the Declaration of Independence and they read there that all men are created equal, then, Lincoln said, they feel that they are flesh of the flesh and blood of the blood of those old men that wrote the Declaration, and so they are. That, he said, is the electric cord that runs through every lover of liberty around the world. When he delivered a eulogy for Henry Clay in 1852, he said, Clay loved his country. He loved his country first because that's a natural instinct. You love the place you've grown up in. You love its familiarity. You love its people. That's natural. But Lincoln went on to say, Clay loved his country because it showed that free men could be prosperous, that if you establish this thing called a democratic republic, if you establish an environment in which people govern themselves, they aren't just going to blow it to pieces the first time a big problem emerges. The people can govern themselves. And that, he said, that was what made Clay love his country, because his country was the preeminent example, almost the only example of the world at that time, being able to say that. So why do we love our country? We love our country because it captures an idea about liberty, about freedom, about equality. And it captures it because it is a self-evident truth hardwired into human nature. And to the extent that our country has given that self-evident truth its most eloquent expression, or as Hamilton put it in the very first of the Federalist Papers, that Americans have it in their hands to be the great demonstrator of the capacity of human beings to govern themselves without aristocrats riding them on their backs with saddles and spurs. To that extent, that is what makes us a nation, an idea that makes us what we are. And that idea brings together people like my great-grandfathers, all of them. It's what brings together people who are descendants of the Mayflower. It's the idea that arms us against tyranny. And it seems to me that idea, much more than notions of blood and soil and race and ethnicity, that is what gives substance to the idea that all men are created equal. That, at least, was Lincoln's understanding of matters. And I am persuaded that not only is he right, but it is a principle that we need to spend some time rediscovering ourselves today.
Well, that's beautifully and compellingly stated, and I think I can't help but my American heart swelling with pride hearing words of that nature, and it is something that bonds us together.
Well,
Um,
don't become too emotional about it. Lincoln would guard against being too
right.
emotional about it. Reason, all conquering reason.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Your book, Our Ancient Faith, one of your many books, but your latest, of course, we've been talking through. There are many other gems in this book that just time does not allow us to unpackage. But I did want to close by giving you an opportunity, as I always do with a guest. Where would we send the listeners if they're interested? I'll put a link to in the show notes to where they can get the book, but learn more about you, your work, websites, podcasts. What would they need to know to learn more about you?
Well, I'm not one of the population of social media. Um, I, I I have my own opinion of social media, and I will admit that it's not a particularly high one. But I do have, almost a little reluctantly, I do have a website, which is simply www.alangelzo.com. I think it's .com. I say I think because I did not create the website. My daughter-in-law, who knows all about this sort of stuff, and I always wait for a visit so I can say, "Oh, I've got this problem with my computer. Can you help me with this?" I'm always presenting these difficulties. She's the officer, the maintainer, the supporter of this website. Um, but you can go and you can find some things about me there, and some of the things I've written. Uh, more than that, I have to admit, I am a techno incompetent. So that's probably the one major port of entry that people will find in the world of the internet and social media.
Well, I must say, as someone who does peruse social media, I don't know that your life is missing any enrichment by staying away from it. You're probably wiser for doing so.
Well, it's the social media environment I have discovered is it it is full of so much misinformation. It's full of so much misconstruction of people. Josh, I have been typecast in on social media by frantic voices who accuse me of being at one extreme a Trotskyist.
Oh my.
Trotskyist, yeah. Yeah, I did some programs for the Worldwide Socialist website, who are interesting people, and they contacted me. They had questions about American history. Well, I regard my job is to answer questions about American history, and unless people that I know are totally out of their minds, um, I'll respond to all questioners. So I've been typecast as being at one end of the political spectrum, a Trotskyist. I've been typecast as being at the other end of the political spectrum, as being a hopeless fascist of some sort. I'm wondering how, uh, but all I can say is I hope that some of the answers I've given to your questions today may give people some notion of where I really can be
Right.
located. But this is one reason why I have to admit I'm very dicey about social media because it just tends to construe people in such terrible ways. And as soon as someone says to me, "Well, I saw so and so said this on X or Twitter or whatever or Instagram," as soon as someone says that, quoting it as some kind of authority, immediately I begin to be doubtful. I think, no, I think I better check with that person first because that's liable to be yet another one of these 149 character misconstructions.
Hmm. Well, and part of my personal failure might be, and I have definitely decreased my imprint on social media over the years, but projects like Saving Elephants are my little attempt to kind of shine the light brightly of hopefully restoring some sanity and nuance in our debate. And I want to say thank you for a wonderful conversation. I've known from both your writing and hearing lectures you give, I had no doubt that that's what it would be. But thank you very much. I appreciate you laying this all out for me, and thank you for taking the time to come on this show.
Well, very good, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on the subject that, well, if you put a nickel in my meter, I often say, on the subject of Lincoln, I'll go all day.